I don't think that we can say thank you enough, so I'm just going to say it again. Uh, Thank you to our hosts for an awesome conference. I'm really honored to be sort of sitting together, not sort of, for sitting together with this panel of illustrious colleagues, and in general with this room of illustrious colleagues. And it's been awesome from the first organizational emails to the days themselves. So thank you for that. Now, my first statement is slightly outside of the talk itself, but it's expected from this panel, I think. And in a way, Pierre Vittorio already set it up at one earlier point. But it's basically, I want to say that I believe that whether we organize history in programmatic terms, following Nietzsche's breakdown into, in his infamous Uses and Abuses, into monumental, antiquarian, or critical, or we see it in terms of the Taforian criticism history binary or coupling, or we parse it into the more recently acceptable and perhaps already obsolete history theory criticism triad. I think that history, every history, is operative. And I'm not really setting this up, I'm just giving it to you as a kind of belief. Now, on the other hand, not everything that is operative may be called history, but I think that this seemingly semantic issue could actually be one of the things that we talk about in this panel. Now today, I prepared two talks, or I started to prepare two talks, and I'm going to present to you the more polished version in which actually some of the points might not be as didactically clear and in your face as the one that I tried to do at first. But so for that reason, I want to just say that basically what I want you to kind of listen for are issues that deal with expanded archives, mashup, and historical simulation. And I will do this via Moss's Afterparty work, which some of you may be familiar, or I'm hoping that you're familiar because it does require you to know something about it. But I want to talk about these issues in more generational terms. And so the talk that I'm not going to present to you, one of the things that I want to kind of bring up from it was that I was talking about, or I was going to talk about contemporary temporaneity, and then maybe that's something to pick up. And in order to set that up, I want to say that there are two important trends today, or developments today. They, of course, rely on larger changes in political, economic, and technological realms. But for an archivist, just the fact that we are now living with an expanded archive in a certain sense, and that it allows us to produce instant narratives, actually produces or allows for a new role that, or a new mode of production that I'm borrowing a name from musical discussions, mashup. And as a kind of, in the world in which architecture is a mashup product, every architect is an operative historian in a way. And as examples for the kind of expansion of the archive, I hope, is easy to understand. It actually relies on the way that we think forward today for a variety of reasons. And certainly technologically, we have archives available all the time. And as an example of that, actually, Archigram's digital archive in our own discipline is an important example. It's already there. It is not exactly dusty. It is not something you go to research in a little cubby. And I learned about this from Simon Sadler's review of it in the recent J. And for a kind of example of instant historical narratives, there are many in the architectural world as well, but the one that's freshly on my mind is a kind of PBS production of Cairo Revolution, which happens a week after the revolution itself happens. And so you get a kind of PBS tone and format and genre of a historical presentation of an event that just happened. So these are some of the kind of contemporary trends within which architects also work, and certainly also historians and critics. But so keep that kind of in mind in the background of this talk. But the talk itself is going to be really a kind of performance of something that is an easy version of an operative criticism piece, basically. And it starts here. So if we needed a concept of a fur-covered roof for partying under, and we did, even if we did not know it, then the 2009 PS1 installation finally delivered one. The Rainer Banham aficionados will recognize in this statement the opening of his endorsement of the fur-covered spaceship interior supplied in 1968 by the movie Barbarella. Unlike Barbarella's interiors, featuring the innocent face and body of the surfer girl Jane Fonda, Afterparty was not presented in Playboy. If it had been presented in those pages, Afterparty would have, of course, immediately confirmed its capacity to support the promiscuity promised us by its architects, Moss, in their third stab at a PS1 blurb. But without an endorsement by Playboy, Afterparty's promiscuity requires disciplinary deciphering. And yes, furriness may have to be part of that interpretive work, but it is hardly the most important issue at stake. What was really interesting about Barbarella was not the fact that its furry, goopy, low-tech, soft porn world made it onto the pages of Playboy, but that Rainer Banham's triumph of software made a nearly canonical place for it in architectural discourse. Banham argued in this piece that Barbarella instantly acquired cult status among architects and architecture students because it was, unlike standard period sci-fi, giving precedence to a malleable and responsive environment over the usual hyper-articulated joinery of hardware. Barbarella's fur and transparent plastic bubbles predictably hit the nerve of the architecture culture of the late 60s, confirming that the period interest in these was pervasive and by extension that architecture was part of a cultural continuum now finally tending towards matters of performance, feedback, and pliability. As we know only too well, in the post-post world, an argument for transdisciplinarity might not be noticed at all. And if it were, it might be judged in bad taste, if for nothing else than for its mimetic resemblance to an old, overly academic paradigm. And yet, since their Afterparty project, Hilary Sample and Michael Meredith of Moss have been arguing for radical inclusion on the lecture circuit. The notion of radical inclusion may signal to some a greedy unwillingness to edit, clarify, or focus, but it could be seen instead as a particularly contemporary commitment to remembering as many lessons in architecture, culture, technology, and politics as possible. So what might be important about Afterparty is that for once, the usual Gen X ambition to value all positions equally, to not be too judgmental, to find a way to do whatever the project called for, to dutifully work with constraints, actually began to resemble a viable position. This is the generation that has both endured the overly simplistic critique leveled at it by the previous one, and has inherited a thoroughly academic version of that previous generation's legacy of criticality and skepticism, together with a world in which symbolic resistance is not an option. The unwillingness to state allegiances clearly, often seen as weakness of mind or heart, is not due only to their meticulously educated awareness of the criticism that could be leveled at them on the basic grounds of oversimplification or dogmatism. But it is also a symptom of an actual generational belief that collecting and repurposing pieces of old legitimating narratives might be more viable today than any of those old narratives in their totality. It is this generation's particular historical task to construct positions after several decades of their collective dismantlement, and to do this at a time when just about every reputable thinker except for Zizek, and power to him for it, agrees that the era of stable positions and large narratives is definitively over. The task of staking out a collective trajectory and cultivating a vital discussion within the discipline about the practice of architecture is objectively harder at this point than at any time before, notwithstanding the flood of apocalyptic and do-gooder narratives in circulation. It is in this context that Moss's radical inclusion and call to architectural promiscuity both begin to provide a framework for a new type of generational position. The vital notion at the basis of both radical inclusion and architectural promiscuity, consciously caring for a multitude of discourses, disciplines, and realities, allows Moss to begin to narrate and perhaps qualify the all-encompassing versatility, realism, and truly expanded expertise that together characterize the Gen X architects. Somewhere between those two notions, radical inclusion and architectural promiscuity, a third bigger one emerges, radical disciplinary promiscuity. If disciplinary promiscuity were to be embraced as an appropriate self-description by a group of architects who already speak of inclusion and expansion of expertise, it would also require, of course, further narration, nurturing, and definition of goals beyond or through this methodological lens, in order to indeed warrant the qualifier radical. But imagine that, not default, not matter of fact, but willed and radical. Sometime after their first PS1 proposal plug-in dropout, Moss team began to articulate their interest in the historical avant-garde and in the idea of simulating a new beginning. In the context of relative flatness of architectural discourse, regardless of and in equal measure, due to its ever-expanding breadth and plurality, and in opposition to that individualistic imperative to get commission, build, publish, and repeat the same steps again, simulating a break and simulating a conversation may be the only way to effectively estrange the familiar conditions of practice and discourse. And by simulation, I especially mean a kind of historical imagination that actually manages to change the structure of historical time itself. Only if we can simulate a belief, or actually believe, that a certain outcome of events is inevitable, can we act in the present as if it were our believed or simulated future's history. If we believed that a generational discourse and focus were not just possible but inevitable, we could begin to actually produce them into existence. Promiscuity. Critics use this term in architecture reviews and they mean different things by it. Sometimes the most grotesque barf rendered in gold gets a wink, a nudge, and a snicker. But architectural promiscuity in Moss's work and writing is of a different kind. Not some feeling we're all simply supposed to agree upon. It is not a case of personal taste turned into a pedagogical, meaning religious, imperative. In Moss's latest PS1 statement, new promiscuities seem to be identified with new methods of design and, more importantly, placed historically in opposition to high formalism. But this simple qualification does not do justice to the coruscating kaleidoscope of projects presented on Moss's website for your pleasure and use in the properly contemporary open source format. We need the idea of radical inclusion in order to ensure that new methods alone not be mistaken for promiscuity. It is not processing or Moss's appellate Moscat that are intrinsically promiscuous. Promiscuity needs normalcy or something like moral purity in order to be meaningful. Only with the historical and cultural knowledge of the architectural discipline, and Gen X is well versed in it, can one really decipher Moss's promiscuity. Since it is a behavior born of exactly that impulse to truncate and splice different degrees of historically incompatible disciplinary narratives and tools. Environmental optimization, constructivist social project, and its non-objective art, together with parametrically generated upside-down catenary curves, real material properties, and fictional movie scripts. It is not any single method here that is promiscuous, but rather it is disciplinary promiscuity itself that constitutes a new method, or at least a more forcefully stated description of a historical predicament. This narrative of inclusion and expansion of expertise is a frequent chant among Gen X architects, but Moss elevates it from a default position to an ambition. Once they have convinced us, and I'm convinced, to consider disciplinary promiscuity as radical and not just as a titillating apology for confusion and lack of judgment, how do we evaluate that furry collection of chimneys? How is the architectural artifact implicated in this narrative? Processing and thatch, the most advanced and the most primitive of architectural techniques, don't simply produce a promiscuous object together. And even if some aspects of the Afterparty beast were grotesque or abject, as Michael Meredith suggests in his Art Forum Confessions, every photograph and certainly every digital representation that accompanies this project is mesmerizing. The shape of Afterparty chimneys is one of the instantiations of Moss's research into the assemblies of shapes that are, well, chimneys on one end, both in terms of their thermal performance and their figural reference, and hipped roofs on the other end. From certain angles, the hipped roofs provide the cartoon gabled roof house image, and when spliced with chimneys, they turn into elongated houses or squashed primitive hut versions of chimneys. Some are more and some are less housey, some are more and some are less chimney stacks, but their aggregation into assemblies ensures that the effect of Recognition is elastic and hovers over the entire grouping, even if unevenly. Equally importantly, recognition here is not only recognition of the archetypal references at play, but also of the deformational logic that is clearly affecting results without being didactically available to the viewers. In Afterparty, the multitude of references invoked by the project and ultimately impossible to synthesize into a singular reading could be described as ensuring a whole new level of interpretive instability. I saw Barbarella in it, as I already said. I also saw Chewbacca, natural history, and these are volcanic chimneys in Turkey, Muppets, primitive huts, and Loger's sort of hut there as a new beginning also, African spas, Rossi's chimneys, minimalist furniture, surrealist objects, Moss's own formal motifs. Postmodernism 101, maybe if it were 99, but since we're talking about the generation that grew up with sampling, with networks as fully internalized and lived protocols, contributing to and learning from Wikipedia, actually taking their environmental responsibility seriously, a generation that remembers with nostalgia of someone who has never been there, the world in which external authoritative truths were preconditions for action, I beg to differ. Moss is struggling to reconnect to broken narratives, to simulate referentiality, and with it to simulate both the effects of recognition and strangeness that are only possible against a background of references and their baggage. Recognizing Moss's own formal research among the rush of personal and cultural references triggered by Afterparty is of great consequence for any possible interpretation of the narrative of architectural promiscuity. The imperative to radically include even incompatible issues and methods does not also mean that Moss's form-making is circumstantial or determined by that inclusion alone. Radical inclusion is not everything goes. Moss's version of inducing the fleeting utopian sentiment through objects, images, and their own positioning narratives works insofar as they manage to reframe and teach us about the historical architectural projects that they are interested in, and of course get us to pay attention to the artifacts that they're churning out. Most importantly, then, Moss is in the business of simulating discourse around their work and around their generation's predicament. This is perhaps what it means to both begin anew and use everything at one's disposal. The world we live in is everything Rayner Banham had dreamt of and more. Barbarella and her furry spaceship have been canonized and made mundane again. Functionalism with a small f is everywhere refracting through one or another kind of parametric command and control. And dealers in architecture culture are fast to get on the iPod app bandwagon. Architecture is everywhere, everything is architecture, and transgressions of disciplinary boundaries or of the once useful boundary between art and life don't faze us. In a world in which damn near everything presents itself as familiar, as Jonathan Lethem described it recently, making familiar strange again through simulating new memories and conversations might reframe our role in that world. The contemporary imperative is to construct narratives of relevance again, and to do that without forgetting who we are in the process of rewriting the links to the history and to the future of our discipline. Now, in offering Afterparty as our own version of Barbarella, I too hope we can begin again, restart a conversation that has not happened yet, about radical disciplinary promiscuity as a position that enabled an entire generation of architects to leverage its expanded expertise as it embraced and rewrote the old political and cultural projects in architecture to fit its time.